Among all the names that evoke the horror of the 20th century, Auschwitz holds a central place. It was not simply a concentration camp. It was the heart of a machine designed to strip a person of their dignity, their identity, and ultimately, their life. For years, men, women, and children rode in sealed wagons. They never knew that their final destination was extermination. More than 1 million people died there. Many left no trace. Others had a tattooed number as the only witness to their existence. But behind every number stood decisions, stood hands, stood faces. There was the cold, bureaucratic logic that turned murder into routine. This is a journey through the darkest side of Auschwitz. It is a story that cannot be softened, that cannot be forgotten. It still shakes us with the magnitude of its pain and the depth of its cruelty. The beginning of the hell was on April the 30th, 1940. Rudolf Höss reached an ambitious goal. At the age of 39, after 6 years of service in the SS, he was appointed commandant of one of the first concentration camps established by the Nazis in the New Reich. That spring day, he arrived to take up his post in a small town. It was located on the territory of former southwestern Poland, which only 18 months before had become part of Upper Silesia. Its Polish name was Oświęcim, and its German name was Auschwitz. Despite the promotion, the concentration camp Höss was to command did not yet exist. In fact, his first task was to oversee its construction. He started with a series of decaying and vermin-ridden barracks that had belonged to the Polish army. The surroundings looked extremely bleak. This domain between the Vistula and the Soa rivers was monotonous, with a humid and unhealthy climate. On that first day, no one could have predicted that in 5 years, this camp would become the site of the greatest slaughter the world had ever seen. The history of the chain of decisions that led to this transformation is one of the most horrifying known to humankind. It allows us to approach in an exceptional way the understanding of how the Nazi state functioned. Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, Reinhard Heydrich, and other Nazi leaders made the decisions that led to the extermination of over 1 million people in Auschwitz. However, the mentality of lower-ranking officials, such as Höss, also played a decisive role in the commission of the crime. Without the command skills he demonstrated in the previously unknown field of mass murder on such a colossal scale, Auschwitz never would have functioned as it did. In reality, there was almost nothing exceptional about Rudolf Höss. He was a man of medium height with regular features and dark hair. Several Polish prisoners from Auschwitz confirm this impression. They recall him as a calm and reserved man, similar to countless people one sees daily on the street without even noticing their presence. His appearance was thus the exact opposite of the traditional stereotype of the red-faced SS monster. What makes him even more frightening are his character and convictions. They were shaped by the events of the last 25 years of German history, the most tumultuous period the country had ever known. Auschwitz concentration camp is synonymous with the absolute evil that Nazism propagated. Jews and Gypsies served as guinea pigs for the Nazis' devilish experiments. More than 1 million people were gassed. They also died from hunger, cold, exhaustion, or simply from loneliness and hopelessness. However, many prisoners resisted the total dehumanization in the camp. They sought to preserve their dignity, maintain hygiene, write, or draw. These actions helped them to survive. The events are told through the voices of those who survived Auschwitz, the unbearable silence after the murder of children, the barbarity of medical experiments on thousands of men and women, the struggle for survival in a camp of terror and death. Auschwitz, the epicenter of the death industry. Auschwitz is today considered the supreme symbol of the Holocaust and Hitler's genocidal policy. This is especially true from 1942 onward, when it became the epicenter of Nazi crimes. It is a unique place. The most extensive deportation camp in the Nazi concentration universe was combined there with the largest extermination center in the history of the Third Reich. That is why Auschwitz became synonymous with absolute evil, as mentioned earlier. It was there, in September 1941, that the first experiment in mass murder in a gas chamber took place, using Soviet prisoners of war. It was there that Jews and Gypsies served as guinea pigs for the devilish experiments conducted by Nazi doctors and nurses. More than 1 million people from 30 European countries were gassed. Over 200,000 men, women, and children died from hunger, cold, disease, exhaustion, and brutality, or simply from loneliness and absolute despair. Nevertheless, Auschwitz did not begin as a concentration camp, even less so as an extermination camp. Located in the surroundings of the town of Auschwitz, the camp was built in the 19th century. It was intended to house immigrants from the province of Galicia, at the time, one of the poorest provinces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were trying to reach Berlin or Vienna. At that time, it consisted of brick dormitories for 3,000 workers and 90 wooden barracks to accommodate over 9,000 workers, as well as other buildings such as a chapel, a theater, and a hospital. The population of the camp quickly exceeded that of Auschwitz, which numbered about 14,000 inhabitants, half of whom were Jewish. The train station, which would have great importance in the future, was little more than 1 kilometer away. It connected the town through Krakow to the railway corridor that led to Hamburg, passing through Wrocław and Berlin. After the First World War, with the change of borders, Auschwitz became part of Poland. What had been a center for immigrants then served as a military barracks. The base of the 21st Regiment of Polish Cavalry was located there until 1938. The German invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, followed by the invasion of the Soviet Union on September 17th of the same year, as provided for in the pact signed by Molotov and von Ribbentrop, would change not only its fate, but also the destiny of the future Auschwitz camp. Indeed, through their respective foreign ministers, who gave the pact its name, the USSR and Germany signed a non-aggression agreement on August 19, 1939. It allowed Germany to attack Poland on September 1st, 1939, without fear of any Soviet intervention. A secret article was included in the pact, providing for the division of Poland and Eastern Europe into Soviet and German spheres of influence. According to this plan, the Soviet army occupied and annexed eastern Poland in the autumn of 1939. The Nazis felt immense contempt for the Poles. In a document sent to Hitler in May 1940, Himmler asserted that their destiny was to be a slave people without education. The German population in the Eastern Territories should not receive an education above elementary school. The goal of the elementary school would only be to teach simple arithmetic, counting up to 500 at most, writing one's name and assimilating that it is God's will to obey the Germans, to be honest, hardworking, and well-behaved. I consider that they do not need to learn to read, he wrote. In this document, which reflected the Nazi racial ideology with sinister clarity, Himmler went further. Polish children aged 6 to 10, whose blood was considered racially acceptable, would be taken from their families. They would be sent to Germany to be raised far from their biological parents. The personal and family tragedy of these children did not concern Himmler. It fit perfectly with the Nazi doctrine that classified and hierarchicalized people according to their race and blood. German repression was primarily aimed at the Polish cultural and religious elites. Men and women were shot. Others were taken prisoner and sent to the Reich's concentration camps. However, the prisons of Upper Silesia soon became overcrowded. In December 1939, Nazi police services accepted the idea of creating a quarantine camp in the area for Polish prisoners before transferring them to Germany. The choice fell on Auschwitz, that is, Auschwitz, 60 kilometers west of Krakow. It was in the zone of Poland annexed by Germany, and its facilities depended on the German army. Rudolf Höss, then the administrator of the Sachsenhausen camp, was commissioned to verify its feasibility. He found the old facilities suitable, provided some repair work was carried out. Himmler approved his report to transform the abandoned camp into a concentration camp, abandoning the initial idea of making it a temporary transit camp for prisoners. Appointed commandant of the new camp, Höss arrived in Auschwitz on May 1, 1940, accompanied by several SS members. In his memoirs, he writes, "The task entrusted to me was not simple. It required transforming a camp whose buildings were well constructed but in a state of complete decay and infested with insects into a complex capable of accommodating or transiting 10,000 prisoners in the shortest possible time. Immediately upon my arrival, the Breslau authorities already wanted to know when the first contingents of prisoners could be received. From the moment of his arrival in Auschwitz in May 1940, Rudolf Höss would create a huge construction site. The old facilities had to be adapted to the new needs. Other buildings were added to the brick buildings. The number of floors was increased. The same facilities as in other concentration camps were constructed: the premises of the Gestapo political command, the kitchen, the showers, the hospital, the prison, the gallows, and the crematorium. Electrified barbed wire fences, 5 meters high, were erected. Roads and streets were laid out. Auschwitz was transformed into a gigantic fortified city. The first prisoners to arrive in Auschwitz on May the 20th were 30 Germans sentenced for common criminal offenses. They were designated to serve as kapos. They came from the Sachsenhausen camp, where they had been specially trained for this function. They were to apply the brutal methods in force since 1933 in the German concentration camps. They were assigned numbers from 1 to 30 as German prisoners of the Reich with supervisory functions, and they were feared by the other prisoners. This group of criminals and their assistants occupied a privileged position in the prisoner integration system and enjoyed the protection of the SS. As camp employees, they were exempt from physical labor and had the right of life and death over the prisoners. They were better fed, wore leather boots and custom-made clothes, and enjoyed other privileges. Basic was one of them. A former criminal, he was a savage tyrant. He forced the prisoners to perform sports, during which they were made to jump, crawl, and lie down under a constant rain of club blows. When, exhausted and bloody, they could no longer get up, Basic would beat them to death. The deaf, the paralyzed, the blind, or the wounded suffered the same fate. The insubordinates were subjected to special treatment before their death. They were hung by their bound hands or deprived of food in a dark cell. In early June 1940, 120 SS men arrived from the Krakow military garrison and from the Buchenwald, Dachau, and Flossenburg camps. Then, on June the 14th, the day the Wehrmacht entered Paris, the first true prisoners arrived. There were 728 Poles, students and soldiers, some of whom were Jewish. In general, these prisoners were suspected of belonging to the Polish resistance. Their first task would be the construction of the camp. However, they would not be enough. At Höss's request, the German mayor of the town of Oświęcim obliged the local Jewish community to provide 300 workers. Once the labor problem was solved, the issue of materials needed for construction remained. Höss had solved the first obstacle. He was lacking the second. The solution he found could not be simpler and more consistent with the camp's ethics. The prisoners were forced to demolish houses that had previously belonged to Poles. They took the bricks, wood, and other materials. Theft, or in the camp jargon, organization, thus became a norm of behavior. Höss himself acknowledges that he was forced to quickly resolve the situation. He had to obtain gasoline for the trip to the city by legal or illegal resources. He had to procure pots for the kitchens by the same resources. As for the necessary barbed wire, he had no choice but to urgently steal the necessary quantity. The prisoners' work was extremely hard and brutal. In July of that same year, the German company Topf and Sons of Erfurt built the first crematorium. It was intended to burn the bodies of the first deceased. This crematorium began to function on August the 15th, 1940. The Auschwitz camp, later called Auschwitz I, housed the Central Political Command and the luxurious residence of Commandant Höss, as well as the barracks for the prisoners and various facilities for service and supply. It was protected by a double fence of barbed wire 5 meters high. A high-voltage electric current ran through it. It was brightly illuminated at night by a series of searchlights every 20 to 30 meters. The fence was interrupted by watchtowers with powerful searchlights illuminating the entire camp. On top of the towers, an SS man stood with a machine gun on a tripod. A gravel-covered space 3 meters wide separated the double fence along its entire length. Anyone caught trying to breach the fence was immediately shot. On March the 1st, 1941, Himmler visited the camp for the first time. He decided to expand it. The objective was to receive 30,000 more prisoners in Auschwitz itself and 100,000 in a new camp that would be constructed. This would be Birkenau, also later called Auschwitz II. It was initially intended to receive prisoners of war. This decision also had economic objectives. It would allow the largest German chemical group, IG Farben, to install a factory in the surroundings. 10,000 prisoners would be employed in its construction. The project to build Birkenau began then, 3 kilometers from the main camp. It started with the expulsion of the inhabitants of the villages in the area. Today, a monument at the camp entrance recalls that in 1941, the inhabitants of these villages were expelled by the German occupation. Birkenau was built on the site of the demolished buildings. Furthermore, the camp owes its name to one of those localities, the village of Berzezinka, or Birkenau in German, located in a birch wood, innocent trees that gave their beautiful name to the most fetid of places. Birkenau, initially intended for Soviet prisoners of war, began to be built on October the 8th, 1941. However, only about 10,000 Russian prisoners arrived, and their function was the construction of the camp. Hungry, exhausted, and brutally treated, they died by the hundreds. The architecture of Birkenau implied crowding and congestion from the beginning. The barracks, mostly wooden, were occupied by 62 three-tiered bunks. In each of them, between 4 and 6 prisoners were forced to share a single bed. There was no privacy, nor was it possible to isolate oneself. There was no place to store even the minimum belongings. The latrines were outside the barracks. They were an endless succession of almost adjoining holes leading to a drain channel. Birkenau is a faithful mirror of the Nazi policy of humiliation and dehumanization of the prisoners. In the end, Birkenau occupied an area of 170 hectares. It was surrounded by 16 kilometers of barbed wire. It had 300 barracks, including living quarters, latrines, kitchens, and warehouses. Until 1945, Birkenau housed the vast majority of the Auschwitz complex prisoners, Jews, Poles, Germans, and Gypsies, in horrible and inhumane conditions. In addition to the crowding and congestion in the barracks where the prisoners huddled, there was insufficient water for hygiene. Their feet were always immersed in mud due to the lack of adequate paths. On rainy days, there was no alternative but to go to bed in wet clothes. Birkenau also had various buildings prepared for the extermination of Jews. Simultaneously a concentration camp and a center for immediate extermination, Auschwitz and Birkenau would become the essential structure of the final solution. This was especially true after 1942, following the Wannsee Conference, the SS in Auschwitz, the people, and the machine. One of the greatest perversions of the Nazi concentration camp system was the forced use of the victims as their own executioners. Thus, in camps exclusively dedicated to extermination, a handful of SS men was enough to achieve the goal. It was the prisoners who were forced to ensure the functioning of the death machine. Auschwitz, however, represented a complex of several camps with a dual function. Therefore, the number of SS guards grew throughout its history. According to the Auschwitz Museum archives, it is estimated that in 1941, there were 700 SS guards. Their number increased to 4,800 men and 71 women by mid-January 1945, due to the need for the final evacuation of the camp. But the total number who served in Auschwitz from 1941 to 1945 was significantly higher, between 8,000 and 8,200 male guards and 200 women. According to the same source, the vast majority of the guards had a low level of education, only elementary school. Only 5.5% had higher education, mainly doctors or architects working in the construction section of the different facilities. Most of them were Catholic, then Lutheran, and then atheist. Among the SS members who belonged to the Nazi Party, the Lutherans constituted the largest group. The majority of the SS guards were of German nationality, Reichsdeutsche or Volksdeutsche. The number of the latter progressively increased, which led to Höss's complaints that thousands of guards barely knew how to speak German. Female guards only began to work in Auschwitz in 1942, with the creation of the women's prisoner camp. This was also due to the increase in male recruitment to the front. Although they did not belong to the SS, which was an exclusively male organization, the candidates signed an agreement with the unit responsible for the camps. They were considered SS members, subject to the same disciplinary rules. Höss writes that, despite the very active propaganda of the National Socialist women's organizations, there were very few volunteers for service in a concentration camp. Those who presented themselves voluntarily or by force underwent a few weeks of training in Ravensbrück, after which they were kept with the prisoners. In a description not devoid of some misogyny, Höss asserts that they were generally of an extremely low moral standard. Despite the relentless sanctions, they systematically stole and used the prisoners as intermediaries. Long years of Nazi indoctrination and the influence of German militaristic culture, along with the morally degrading atmosphere of the camp, led the SS guards to a gradual dehumanization. This conditioned their behavior in an intolerable manner, even from the perspective of the SS itself. Two attitudes characterized this behavior: sadism and corruption. Beyond the hunger, the cold, the exhausting labor, the lack of hygiene, and the overcrowding inherent in the concentration universe conceived by Nazism, beyond the punishments for disciplinary offenses, the medical experiments on living people, and the gassing of victims, the guards engaged in other services on their own initiative. The consequences of sadism for the prisoners were irrelevant to the camp administration. In this sense, it took two initiatives: the creation of a brothel, which proved impotent to stop their perverse impulses, and, more significantly, the substitution of the guards with the prisoners themselves in the application of discipline, including beatings and other punishments. This last initiative had a profound effect on the prisoners, causing them immense suffering. The commandant of Auschwitz himself confirms, those who were still capable of reacting experienced an inexplicable pain when they were treated in this way by their own comrades. The cruelties of the perfidy of the guards had a much smaller effect on them than the brutality of their unfortunate fellows. Nothing oppressed them more than the feeling of absolute powerlessness before the moral tortures inflicted by the latter. Corruption proved to be a much more complex problem for the Nazi administration. The SS sought to create the image of an untarnished organization. For Himmler, an SS man could not simultaneously possess an ideal and line his pockets, have relations with Jewish women, or drown in alcohol at collective drinking sprees. Therefore, in 1941, an exceptional SS and police tribunal was created to fight corruption under the leadership of Judge Konrad Morgen. Morgen managed to conduct several investigations into high-ranking SS officials, especially in Auschwitz. He went there in mid-1943, alerted by the discovery of a personal package from the camp containing 2 kilograms of gold from the victims' teeth. Corruption remained inexorable over the years. It intensified as the end of the war approached, and demoralization set in with the prospect of Germany's defeat. Not only simple guards, but also the highest SS ranks benefited widely from it, although in these cases, generally without criminal consequences. Furthermore, the tribunal only accused leaders who were not too powerful. In the end, Maximilian Grabner, Gerhard Palitsch, and Hans Aumeier, high-ranking SS leaders in Auschwitz, were among the leaders investigated by Morgen, but without consequences. Another was the commandant of Auschwitz himself, Rudolf Höss. He was accused of having impregnated a prisoner. Höss was interrogated, but he was too big a figure. The tribunal was subjected to threats, and the matter was conveniently forgotten. On July the 31st, 1941, Göring, by letter, instructed Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Service, to proceed with all necessary organizational, practical, and financial preparations for a global solution to the Jewish question in the German sphere of influence in Europe. In August of the same year, Hitler states, "I will not rest until we have drawn the last consequences regarding the Jews." Both Göring's letter and Hitler's statement, followed by many others in the same vein, testify to a crucial escalation of anti-Jewish Nazi rhetoric. From the autumn of 1941 onward, Hitler's speech became increasingly clear and threatening. Indeed, parallel to the German army's growing inability to defeat the Soviet army, anger and hatred toward the Jews, the old and ever guilty enemy, increased. This time, they were accused of acting against Germany under the Bolshevik uniform. All of October followed with diatribes oozing growing hatred. On the 17th of that month during a dinner, Hitler asserts that the elimination of the Jews is a prerequisite for any change. And on the 21st he warns, "By eliminating this plague, we will render a service to humanity that the German people cannot yet comprehend." In December, especially after the Japanese attack on the American naval base of Pearl Harbor, Germany, according to Hitler, declared war on the United States. Indeed, in the autumn of 1941, some of the main preparatory measures for systematic extermination were taken. These included the introduction of the Yellow Star on September the 1st for all Jews over 6 years old, and the mass deportations to the east on September the 18th. On December the 6th, the gas trucks of Chelmno, the first death camp, were ready to operate. Their deadly capacity was 1,000 people per day. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka would follow them within the framework of the so-called Action Reinhardt. The extermination enterprise, initiated by the mass killings of Jews and Bolsheviks carried out mainly by the Einsatzgruppen, was then systematically organized from the first half of 1942. This was done through political administrative decisions, ranging from the creation of a single command in Germany with clearly defined responsibilities, particularly after the Wannsee Conference, to negotiations with the authorities of the occupied countries. The objective was to establish an organized and efficient system of deportation, selection, forced labor, and extermination. On May the 18th, 1942, an assassination attempt took place in Berlin at the site of the anti-Soviet exhibition, the Soviet Paradise. And on the 27th of the same month, Heydrich, as mentioned earlier, was the target of a bomb attack by the Czech resistance, ultimately dying on July the 4th. In response to this attack, the Germans razed the entire village of Lidice near Prague, where the resistance fighters were supposedly hidden. All the men of the village were killed. The women were deported to concentration camps, and the children were mostly sent to Chelmno and then probably gassed. Following these two incidents, on July the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, 1942, a meeting took place between Hitler and Himmler. The objective was to accelerate the extermination program. It was also during this period that the decision was made to transform Auschwitz into the largest extermination center in the Reich. That same summer, Rudolf Höss was summoned by Hitler. In his testimony, Höss asserts, albeit with doubt, that the meeting took place in the summer of 1941. However, most historians believe that the commandant of Auschwitz was mistaken about the year. He was actually summoned in the summer of 1942, not the summer of 1941. In fact, as we have just seen, the concrete decision to exterminate all Jews in Europe was only adopted in the autumn of 1941. Höss writes, "In the summer of 1941, I was suddenly summoned to Berlin by the Reichsführer SS through one of his adjutants. Contrary to his habits, he received me alone and stated the following. The Führer has ordered that the final solution to the Jewish question be proceeded with. We, the SS, are responsible for carrying out this order. The extermination centers existing in the East do not have the resources to carry out the planned large-scale actions. Auschwitz has therefore been chosen for this purpose. Firstly, because of its advantageous location in terms of communications, and secondly, because the site designated for such an action can easily be isolated and camouflaged. A difficult and painstaking task awaits you in this region. You must dedicate yourself entirely to it and not be distracted by the difficulties ahead. The details will be communicated to you by Sturmbannführer Eichmann, who will meet with you shortly. The participating departments will be informed by me in due course. You must maintain total silence about this order even before your superiors. After your conversation with Eichmann, you will immediately send me the plans for the proposed facility. The Jews are the eternal enemies of the German people and must be exterminated. All Jews that we can reach must be destroyed without exception now during the war. If we do not succeed in destroying the biological basis of Jewry today, the Jews will later destroy the German people." Eichmann arrived in Auschwitz in August, along with Höss. They were to plan the extermination process. Eichmann explained that the only possible method was gas. The inclusion of women and children in the liquidation plan made the shooting method too costly for the SS men who had to carry it out. After studying the different types of gas that were already used in the gas vans and for the extermination of the mentally ill, they agreed on the use of the more practical gas, Zyklon B. Who were the prisoners of Auschwitz? "Here live the dead," read the inscription engraved on one of the prisoner barracks. Indeed, in the universe of concentration camps created by the Nazis, the prisoners were an army of slaves in striped uniforms. Their function was to work for their own destruction. In the diabolical crucible of Auschwitz, the deportees were manipulated and adapted by the Nazis. They were forced to participate in the execution of their own death. For the prisoners, the impact immediately upon arrival at the camp was terrible. The sinister appearance of the barbed wire, the diabolical spectacle of the flames emerging from the crematoria, the nauseating smell of burning flesh and hair, all were accompanied by the brutality with which they were received. The violent and immediate separation from their relatives and the ignorance of what awaited them turned the prisoners' arrival into an anonymous nightmare. All survivors in their memoirs speak of this dreadful initial shock. Before the deafening noise of the SS shouting and the threatening barking of the dogs, before the blows and the blinding light of the searchlights, they remained stunned, stupefied, and speechless. Arrival at the camp represented a radical rupture. It was the crossing of a border, the entry into a completely unknown, unexpected, and unpredictable universe. After the initial selection, children, the elderly, the sick, or those considered unfit for work, were placed in the left line. They were immediately murdered in the gas chambers. The rest were placed in the right line, and their end was postponed for a few months. It is said that of 500 men, women, and children who arrived in Auschwitz, only 96 men and 29 women were selected for work. The number of those selected in the right line depended less on their physical fitness than on the momentary needs of the camp or the available space. A transit to the main camp, Auschwitz-Thubonz or Auschwitz II Auschwitz III, Monowitz, awaited them. There, they were forced to undress in front of each other. Then followed disinfection, shaving of the entire body from head to toe, including the most intimate parts, showers, and the distribution of clothing. Finally, the prisoner was registered. A form with his personal data was filled out, which was then sent to the political department of the camp and copied in 5 copies for the different sectors. To conclude, a number was assigned to him, which replaced his name for the duration of his stay in the camp. With the exception of the German criminal prisoners transferred from other camps to perform the functions of capo, the first prisoners were Polish men. Until the beginning of 1942, they constituted the largest contingent of Auschwitz prisoners, between 140,000 and 150,000 people, including some women, of whom about 74,000 died there. They were mostly political prisoners, arrested for belonging to the nationalist or communist resistance, or ordinary civilians. They usually wore a red triangle with the letter P, denoting their nationality, sewn on their chest. There were also Jews in the same circumstances, but they were arrested individually for the same reasons. In general, they knew that they would stay in the camp until the end of the war. Although convinced of Germany's final defeat, they lived in fear of not surviving until the end. Indeed, the gradual deterioration of the camp conditions, the epidemics, the growing shortage of food, the overcrowding, all these factors reduced the chances of survival. The thought had naturally come to rest. The possibility of denunciation or exposure of affiliation with the resistance movement was a very real risk, so much so that various political groups fought fiercely among themselves. Despite all this, national solidarity among the Poles proved stronger than their political differences. This allowed them to occupy certain privileged positions within the camp. As the war progressed, the number of political prisoners of other nationalities grew, especially Czechs, Slovaks, French, Dutch, and Belgians. The letter of the country was marked in the center of the red triangle used to identify them, except for the Germans. The reputation of different national groups among the political prisoners was volatile. The Czechs were considered good, the Russians untrustworthy and wild, and the Yugoslavs, especially the women, were highly valued for their courageous fight against Nazism. In the underground organization of the women's camp, the leaders were French women, though this generalization certainly has its flaws. Often, national solidarity prevailed over ideology or religion, even among the Jewish prisoners. Nevertheless, the red triangle was not always synonymous with a spirit of solidarity or ethical behavior. The second group consisted of Russian prisoners of war. They arrived at Auschwitz in the middle of 1941 to construct the Birkenau camp. Their condition was already pitiful due to their previous stay in the Lambsdorff camp, from which they had walked for many weeks, almost without food. Until 1942, They were kept in separate blocks within Auschwitz, forming a distinct camp, the Russian prisoner of war camp. Almost all of them died from exhausting labor, starvation, mistreatment, or were gassed. Huss himself confesses that the physical state of the Russians was so wretched that they no longer showed any reaction. They wandered aimlessly and expressionlessly, hiding in any corner to eat any edible thing they happened to find, or to die in silence. The third group, who wore the green triangle, were professional criminals, former convicts, and individuals with prior police records. They often acted as supervisors over the other prisoners. The selection of murderers, thieves, traffickers, and sadists for this type of service was not alien to the worldview that prevailed in the universe of Nazi concentration camps. For the Nazis, the eradication of all established moral norms meant that beating a prisoner to death was not a crime. It was simply registered that such and such a number had died. The cause of death was perfectly coincidental. Himmler constantly insisted on the idea that pity was a betrayal of the SS ideals. Another group consisted of those identified with the Black Triangle. These were women engaged in prostitution, especially German women, lesbians, and tramps. The women's camp was dominated by the untattooed, meaning the ASO criminal women, most of whom were German. They often acted as block supervisors. There were also Polish women. In contrast to the Dachau and Sachsenhausen camps, where homosexuals and Jehovah's Witnesses were numerous, they constituted relatively small groups at Auschwitz. Homosexuality in Germany was severely punished by the Nazi regime, and homosexual men were considered enemies of the state. This explains their greater presence in the re-education camps created after 1933. From the beginning, homosexual prisoners had their own mark, the pink triangle. Female homosexuality was not given the same significance. Lesbians were included in the IT group and wore the same black triangle. From the Nazi point of view, a woman was merely a childbearer, serving the multiplication of the race, and her personal preferences were completely irrelevant. It is estimated that about 50,000 homosexuals were arrested in Germany, and of these, between 10,000 and 15,000 perished in the camps. The last group of prisoners who passed through Auschwitz were, for the most part, the Jews. From 1942, the Jews became the main group at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and the only one destined for total annihilation. They were marked with two yellow triangles forming a Star of David with the initial of the country of origin. The selection of those to be killed immediately was made by SS doctors on the arrival ramp at Birkenau. The Judenrampe began operating on July 4, 1942, with the deportation of Slovaks, and ended in November 1944, with the conclusion of the gas killings of 500,000 Hungarians on the Van Rampe, specially built for this purpose. The SS generally considered that Jews ceased to live the very moment they descended from the railcars upon arrival at the camp. All humiliations, all abuses by the SS and the Kapos were thus legitimized. As mentioned, about 1 million Jews died at Auschwitz-Birkenau, including hundreds of thousands of children. But what makes the killing of Jews unique is not the number of victims, but the intention of the perpetrators. Only in the case of the Jews did the Nazis plan the physical destruction of every man, every woman, and every child. All other groups mentioned earlier were objects of Nazi terror, but only the Jews were doomed to disappear from the face of the earth. Once again, the Commandant of Auschwitz himself confirms this in his memoirs. The hierarchical arrangement of the triangles reflected the ideological priorities of the SS, which were often internalized by the prisoners themselves. This often unconscious identification made the color of the triangle a highly effective means of social classification. The result was a stratification of the prisoners from top to bottom, which ensured the effective functioning of the divide and rule principle necessary in the space of the Nazi concentration camps. The status assigned by the wearers of the triangles sometimes differed from camp to camp and from period to period. Nevertheless, the wearers of the red and green triangles, meaning the political prisoners and the criminals, were usually at the top. The lowest category in the hierarchy was always occupied by those who wore the yellow triangle, the Jews. Just above them were the wearers of the black triangles and the ASOs, and then the wearers of the purple triangles, the Jehovah's Witnesses, potentially in a better position. While the prisoners for common crimes were there for their offenses, the German political prisoners for their opposition to the regime, and the prisoners of other nationalities for their more or less proven opposition to the German occupation, age was the only criterion for Jewish prisoners from all countries under Nazi domination, even for the Roma. The most infamous medical experiments at Auschwitz. The practice of medicine in Hitler's Germany represents one of the darkest aspects of Holocaust history. The Nazis assigned doctors a central role in the extermination program. Not only did they actively participate in the so-called mercy killing, meaning the T4 program, killing people whom Nazism considered unworthy of life, but it was also they who, when victims arrived at the concentration or extermination camps, selected who would die immediately and who would contribute a little longer to the German war effort. It was the doctors, despite the oath to save human lives, who conducted the most repulsive pseudo-scientific experiments on children, women, and men, simply denying them the right to life and physical integrity. The adult euthanasia program also began in 1939. All people with illnesses and disabilities were killed in gas chambers and incinerated with the complicity of the medical profession. The death certificates indicated false diagnoses of death according to the age and previous symptoms of the victims. Finally, the sick with minor deformities, moderately old people, war invalids, difficult children, and other similar cases were also selected by doctors for euthanasia. This Nazi program was responsible for the death of at least 70,000 people in Germany until 1941, and was then directed at the extermination of Jews, Roma, Poles, Russians, and Germans who opposed the Nazi regime between 1942 and 1945. Approximately 70 medical research projects were carried out in the Nazi camps by German universities and research institutes, which included numerous types of experiments on prisoners. Himmler showed great interest in this type of activity from the beginning. In 1943, wishing to protect the experiments, he ordered that all of them be subjected to his prior approval. Himmler did not limit himself to facilitating them. He carefully monitored their development, studied the results, and even suggested some improvements. But above all, he protected the doctors, taking responsibility for their actions, and did not hesitate to contradict possible critics, considering them to be weaklings. About 200 doctors were deployed to the concentration camps. Their job was to conduct selections and participate in the medical trials. The injection of phenol directly into the heart or intravenously to prolong the agony, the inoculation of the typhus virus, injections into the eyes to change their color, sterilization, castration, subcutaneous injections causing painful tumors, and experiments on changes in muscle tissue due to malnutrition were just some of the pseudo-scientific tortures to which men, women, and children were subjected in complete and absolute violation of the medical ethical code. Many experiments were aimed at justifying and applying racist theories through biology and promoting the superiority and multiplication of the Aryan race. For example, 40 Roma were subjected to experiments to prove that they had different blood. 150 Jewish women and men killed at Auschwitz served the doctors to observe the peculiarities of their skulls within the framework of the race struggle. Experiments conducted with dwarfs and twins are also included. Other research aimed to develop mechanisms for survival in extreme conditions at high altitudes, low temperatures, or with the ingestion of seawater. Vaccines and remedies were also tested to combat infectious diseases, wounds, or when inhaling chemical gases. A series of experiments was dedicated to discovering the fastest and most effective method of destroying human life, from the total sterilization of women to the injection of chloroform into the heart of the victims and the use of Zyklon B gas. All these experiments, entailing unbearable suffering, were carried out on human beings, and obviously, against their will. Among all the SS doctors who worked at Auschwitz, one name left an indelible memory on the survivors: Josef Mengele, the chief camp physician, better known as the Butcher of Auschwitz, or even the Angel of Death. From 1943 until the evacuation of the camp in January 1945, he was responsible for the death of approximately 400,000 people. It was he who received the deportees as they descended from the rail cars, directing the initial selection with a whip in hand. They would encounter him again during the partial selections, when with a careless movement of his index finger, he would point out the victims, all while whistling an opera aria. But in reality, Mengele, a doctor of medicine and philosophy, did not limit himself to the selections. According to Dr. Miklos Nisli, who arrived at Auschwitz in May 1944, deported from Hungary with a group of prisoners consisting of 200 physicians, 6 pharmacists, and their families. Upon the arrival of the transports, several guards would patrol the ranks of prisoners looking for twins and dwarfs. Some mothers, believing they would be better treated, did not hesitate to hand them over. They did not know that they would soon die at the hands of Mengele. Therefore, Mengele, as soon as he arrived, separated the dwarfs and twins on the ramp with the same purpose. He placed them in the right-hand row and took those who were not yet to die to the barracks. There, they received good food and good hygienic conditions, so that there was no possibility of one of them becoming infected. Therefore, they could not die separately. They had to die together, and in good health. Convinced that he was the person to discover the reason for multiple births, Mengele would sit for hours at the microscope and the dissection table. In his lab coat and bloody hands, he obsessively researched and compared. The screams of the victims, the black smoke of the crematoria, and the smell of burning flesh did not bother him. After each selection, Mengele returned to that human hell, where he felt at home among villains and criminals. The most dangerous type among villains and criminals is the criminal doctor, writes Nisli. The life and death of hundreds of thousands of people were in his hands, and he did not hesitate to use his power according to his criminal vision of humanity. The testimony of Miklos Nisli, written in 1946, is exceptional. Appointed by Mengele as the chief physician of the crematoria, Nisli, as he himself mentions, was an eyewitness and involuntary participant in the work in the crematoria of Auschwitz, in whose flames more than 1 million human lives disappeared. Despite being a prisoner, Nisli was far from being in the same situation as the other prisoners, not only because his personal situation in terms of food, clothing, and comfort in the camp was completely different, but above all because of the function he performed, dissecting the dead and identifying pathologies. In addition, as the chief physician of the crematoria, he depended exclusively on Mengele's direct orders, so he came to live and work at the center of the Nazi extermination machine. In addition to his anatomical and laboratory work, Nisli was also in charge of the medical care of all the SS personnel in the crematoria, about 120 people, and 860 prisoners of the Sonderkommando. He could move through the 4 crematoria from 7 in the morning to 7 in the evening. One day, Nisli received the medical records of 2 small twins in a coffin. In his notes, he recounts, "I lifted the lid. Inside lay 2 two-year-old twins. I ordered 2 of my men to put the bodies on the dissection table located inside the crematoria. I opened the medical histories and studied them. Careful clinical analyses, accompanied by X-rays, descriptions, and drawings, indicated the different characteristics of these 2 small beings. From a scientific point of view, only the pathological conclusion was missing, and my job was to produce it. The twins had died simultaneously, and at that moment lay next to each other on the dissection table. It was they, or their small bodies, that were supposed to reveal the secret of the reproduction of the race, to take a step forward in the discovery of the secret of the reproduction of the superior beings destined to rule. This was the goal. In the future, every German mother had to give birth to as many twins as possible in her womb. The project, conceived by the theorists of the Third Reich, was absolute madness, and these experiments were entrusted to Dr. Mengele, the chief physician of the Auschwitz camp, the infamous criminal doctor. The immediate goal was the production of pure-blood Germans to replace the Czechs, Hungarians, and Poles, all condemned to extermination. The next day, dissecting the corpses of 4 pairs of Roma twin children under 10 years old, Nisli made this discovery that terrified him. All 4 children had died from an injection of chloroform into the heart, causing immediate death from cardiac collapse. SS guards with dogs had broken into the barracks and led everyone outside, forcing them to line up. By the next morning, everyone had already turned to ashes. It was still piled up in the courtyard outside the crematorium, awaiting disposal. However, by direct order of Mengele, the bodies of 12 pairs of twins were not consigned to the flames. Before being sent to the gas chamber, Mengele marked them with special chalk. This group included twins of different ages, from newborns to 16-year-old adolescents. At that moment, writes Naisley, they lay on the floor of the morgue, the bodies of dark-haired and swarthy children. The work of sorting them into pairs was exhausting. He had to be careful not to confuse them, because if anything damaged the study of these rare specimens, he would pay with his life. After the dissection, Naisley handed the corpses over to the members of the Sonderkommando for burning and preserved the organs of scientific interest for Mengelé's analysis and selection. They were then sent to the Anthropological Institute in Berlin-Dahlem. In addition to deaths from gas and injections of chloroform into the heart, Naisley also recorded deaths from gunfire. One night, while he was still in the dissection room, he heard shots in the adjacent compartment accompanied by heart-rending screams. He counted 70 shots, and when silence fell, he went to see what had happened. Naisley recalls, "It was a Dantesque scene. Before me lay scattered, naked bodies, 70 women, contorted, soaked in their own blood and that of others. They were intertwined, forming a diabolical cluster. As my eyes became accustomed to the darkness of the room, I discovered with horror that not all were dead. Some were still breathing, slowly moving their arms and legs with a glassy stare, trying to lift their bloody heads. I lifted the heads of some of them, 2 or 3 who were still alive, and I realized that in addition to death by gas and chloroform injection, there was a third way to kill. A bullet in the back of the neck. Birkenau Auschwitz, and the final solution. From the wall of death to the gas chambers by the Sonderkommandos." As already explained, the first experience of killing in a gas chamber was carried out at Auschwitz. The initiative to use Zyklon B gas belonged to SS Oberscharführer Karl Fritsch, who made the decision in the absence of the camp commandant Rudolf Höss. He later boasted that he was the inventor of the extermination of prisoners by gas. However, the liquidation process was planned from the beginning, and the gassing of prisoners was carried out in the camp prison located in Block 11, whose windows had been bricked up. It was primarily intended for men and women suspected of acts of resistance, preparation, or complicity in escape, or contacts with the outside world. Zyklon B gas was produced by the Degisch Company, created in 1917. It was a powerful pesticide containing 95% hydrocyanic acid, a percentage that later grew to almost 100%, which allowed the lethal capacity of the product to be increased. A Degisch document indicates that between 1942 and 1943, the company supplied 27,434.5 kilograms of Zyklon B to all the camps, of which 1,965.69 kilograms were destined for Auschwitz alone. According to the testimonies of Höss and members of the Sonderkommando, a much smaller amount of gas would have been enough to kill 1 million people at Auschwitz. On the first and second floors of Block 11, more than 100 prisoners were kept in large cells. In the basement, the most dangerous prisoners were locked in small, dark cubicles of such low height that it was impossible to stand up. Philipp Müller, a prisoner at Auschwitz for 3 years, testifies, "The SS men took us to Block 11, whose entrance door was locked, unlike the other blocks. The SS Oberscharführer Plage opened it and ordered us to enter. We descended a labyrinth of corridors leading to the cells and underground dungeons of the block. The silence was only broken by the jingle of his keys. Our jailer opened the barred door, whose lock creaked, and we entered the central corridor. A suffocating stench filled us. The floor of the corridor leading to the cells was darkened and greasy. The walls were whitewashed and the light was dim. The cell into which Morris and I were pushed had no windows or ventilation. It was about 3 by 3 meters. When the guard closed the iron door, total darkness fell. Every Saturday morning the cells were cleaned. After a brief meeting to review the prisoners' reports, a commission consisting of the doctor and the block chiefs, led by the camp commandant, went down to the basement. The purpose was to remove the prisoners sentenced to death. They were taken to the washrooms and forced to undress. As mentioned earlier, the indelible tattooing of numbers upon the prisoners' arrival at the camp was only carried out from March 1942. After registering those sentenced to death, they were led to a brick wall separating Block 11 from Block 10, to which a kind of black cloth was attached. The prisoners were then executed with a shot to the back of the neck, facing the wall. After death, the bodies were collected by other prisoners, who carried them away on stretchers, and then left them in a corner, before transporting them to the crematorium. In one of the cells of Block 11 was the Franciscan priest Maximilian Kolbe, born in 1894. He was captured in February 1941 and interned in the Pawiak prison in Warsaw. 3 months later, he was deported to Auschwitz, where he was assigned the number 16,670. Following the escape of a prisoner from his block, the SS men decided in retaliation to kill every 10th prisoner in the block at random. Among them was a Polish worker named Franciszek Gajowniczek, who was married and had a son. The man bitterly lamented what would now happen to my wife and son. Kolbe heard Franciszek's cry and made the decision to save the worker's life, offering himself in his place, to which the SS men agreed. Kolbe was killed 2 weeks later by an injection of phenol. Between 1943 and 1945, a group of Jewish prisoners, a few Poles, and some Soviet prisoners of war lived longer than any other prisoners at the center of the catastrophe. They were part of the Sonderkommando, which was entrusted with the most repulsive of tasks, the functioning of the Birkenau extermination apparatus as part of the implementation of the final solution to the Jewish question. Almost all of this commando, which was cyclically renewed, was eventually killed by the camp's SS men. Their life lasted approximately 4 months. At the end of this period, an SS company gathered the commando and shot all its members. Half an hour later, a new group arrived, assigned to the Sonderkommando. They were forced to remove the clothes from their dead comrades, of whom soon only ashes remained. The first task of each Sonderkommando was to burn its predecessors. Neasley recounts that during his medical examinations, there was always someone unable to bear his duties, who begged for a quick and painless poison. The commando's main role was to help the SS men lead people into the changing rooms, help them undress, and enter the gas chambers. Sometimes they themselves had to lift the lid of the holes through which the SS men poured the Zyklon B. Until now, writes Shlomo Venetia, I had never talked about it before, because it is hard for me to admit that we had to open and close the lid after the gas was released, but it is true. Then they had to collect the clothes and personal belongings, extract the corpses from the gas chambers, burn them in the cremation ovens or in the pits, and transport the ashes for burial or dispersion. Due to the intrinsic nature of the work they were forced to perform, they were at the heart of the death machine. They had access to the most hidden facts of the mass extermination. Joining the Sonderkommando meant never leaving it again. Like the builders of the tombs of the Egyptian pharaohs quoted by Heydrich, who boasted of being the initiator of the creation of special commandos destined for death precisely because of the knowledge they had access to. Hence, they lived in complete isolation from the other prisoners, with whom they were forbidden to communicate. In a way, they were the invisible prisoners. The SS men guaranteed the members of the Sonderkommando better living conditions than the other prisoners in terms of food, accommodation, and clothing. The purpose was, on the one hand, to maintain their physical fitness, without which the burning of thousands of corpses could not be carried out within the established deadlines. On the other hand, it was also done to bribe them to ensure their cooperation. The Sonderkommando worked in 12-hour shifts, with a daytime service schedule starting at 6 in the morning and a nighttime one starting at 6 in the evening. There were other tasks related to the extermination actions. They assisted on the ramp when the rail cars arrived and transported the corpses they found there. In the crematorium, when the newly arrived group was small, people were executed directly with a shot to the back of the neck instead of being gassed. The Sonderkommando was responsible for holding them during the execution and taking them to the crematorium. Another group of about 15 commando members was responsible for cleaning and drying the already shorn hair of the women. Others crushed the human bones with a wooden mallet that the fire had not been able to destroy to turn them into dust. The Sonderkommando also destroyed books, identity documents, and other personal belongings that the camp management considered uninteresting. The last task that the few remaining men in the Sonderkommando were forced to perform from November 1944 was the destruction of the evidence of the crime. They demolished the walls of Crematorium 4, which had been set on fire during the rebellion in October 1944. They dismantled the ovens in Crematoria 2 and 3, drilled holes in the walls to later destroy them with explosives. They transported the ashes to the river and leveled the ground in the pits where they burned and buried the corpses. In all phases of their work, The Sonderkommando was strictly guarded and controlled by SS members with the help of the capos. They were required to behave in a way that would dispel any fears or suspicions of those condemned to death. Therefore, they were usually recruited from the same transports destined for the gas chambers so that they could communicate in the same language as the condemned. They were forced to hide the fate awaiting the victims, and even spread false information, at least in the presence of the SS. Sometimes the Sonderkommando prisoners secretly warned other prisoners of the danger they were exposed to, but when they were discovered, they were punished with a terrible death. They were usually thrown alive into the ovens. Franciszek Piper, scientific director of the Auschwitz Museum, writes that the members of the Special Commando were recruited without knowing the task they were going to perform. In a diversionary maneuver, they were asked about their profession and promised work in better conditions than the other prisoners. But despite the better food and sleep, all its members were repelled by the work they were forced to do, and all of them were fully aware of contributing to the acceleration of the extermination of their brethren. Therefore, Piper continues, for all the Sonderkommando prisoners, this task first caused a psychological shock, which then led to depression and sometimes suicide. This was the case of Minohemish from Greece, who on May 18, 1944, threw himself into the fire with a body he was transporting. A German sergeant named Grinberg shot him in the head to spare him the suffering. Also, Shlomo Venezia, deported at 21 years old from Thessaloniki to Auschwitz-Birkenau on April 11, 1944, states, "There is nothing harder than leading people to their death. The first 10 or 20 days I was in a state of continuous shock at the monstrosity of the crime. Then I stopped thinking. Every day I preferred to die. And yet, every day, I fought for survival." Despite the initial shock, some of the prisoners from the Special Commando eventually became accustomed, becoming indifferent to the fate of those whose death ensured their own lives. But for most, among whom were some practicing Jews, their work was a constant torture that could only end with their own death. They suffered with the victims, often relatives and friends, and the feeling of guilt constantly tormented them because they knew themselves to be accomplices, albeit forced, in the crime against men, women, and children, the overwhelming majority of their own people. When they were confronted with the presence of relatives or acquaintances, the Sonderkommando members burned them separately. They collected the ashes of each one in separate jars and recorded the name of the deceased, the date of birth, and the date of his murder. Then they buried the jars and, when they could, read the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer of mourning. Some of these men clearly saw that the bond that united them with humanity was doomed, and that the only way out was rebellion. They themselves were also undergoing a process of gradual annihilation, and they realized that they had extremely little time. Thus, they devised a plan, unique in the history of the camp, which led to a general uprising. Due to successive delays imposed by the central resistance of the camp, they carried out a desperate revolt. More than 400 members of the Sonderkommando were killed, and the uprising could not stop the extermination process, but it showed that these men still preserved the strength to say enough. The last gas executions in Birkenau Auschwitz. In the autumn of 1944, Mengele decided to liquidate the B2 camp, where the Hungarian women were housed. Every night, writes Miklos Nisli, 50 trucks carried the victims, 4,000 per night, to the crematoria. It was a Dantesque spectacle. Those trucks in a caravan, their headlights probing the darkness, each one with a human cargo of 50 women who filled the air with their screams or simply sat silent, paralyzed by fear. In a slow parade, the trucks arrived and unloaded the women, already completely naked, at the stairs leading to the gas chamber. From there, they were quickly pushed down. The camp prisoners lived 4 months in the shadow of the gates of the crematoria. It only took 10 days for 45,000 emaciated bodies to pass through them and leave their souls there. A deadly silence fell over the C camp, whose fence surrounded so many tragedies. The last gassing at Birkenau occurred in November 1944. The Soviet army was rapidly approaching, and the nervousness of the SS grew proportionally. Every day in the crematoria, not only human lives but also card files, lists of the names of the dead, indictments, and all kinds of documents were burned. At the end of November, crematoria 2 and 3 were dismantled, and the selection continued in the ranks of the Sonderkommando. Only about 100 prisoners remained in the Special Commando, among whom was Müller. Although without the slightest hope of surviving, all the more so since the source, if not of survival, then at least of prolonging their lives, had dried up. The property belonging to the dead, which they managed to steal and which they used to bribe and pay off the SS. And yet, when it comes to survival, imagination knows no bounds. The prisoners began to manufacture fake teeth, which they filled with plaster and covered with copper, shiny like gold, which allowed them to continue trading. On January 17, the last roll call took place, bringing together the 700 prisoners of Auschwitz, including Birkenau and Monowitz, who still remained. And the next day, the order to evacuate the camp was given. 5,800 prisoners were sent on a death march that would take them to the Mauthausen camp in Austria. Among them were most of the surviving members of the Sonderkommando who managed to infiltrate. They were mostly Poles, 25 Greeks, and a few Slovaks. During this march on foot, in polar cold, and then in open rail cars, many prisoners died or were shot. The Americans liberated Mauthausen on May 9. Philipp Müller and Shlomo Venezia were among the few Sonderkommando members who survived Auschwitz-Birkenau and the Death March. Venezia spent 7 years in hospitals because of the poor condition of his lungs. It took Venezia 47 years to speak about his experience in the camp. Only then could he tell the woman he married about it, the mother of his children. The secret remained inside him like a memory of the camp. Would you like me to adjust this further, or work on another text for you?